Hey guys, this is Virtual Environmental Education. This is our 10th lesson, Habitat Destruction. My name is Anna. I am the co-president of Sustainability Club, which is a club that created this program.
Hi guys, I'm Joseph. I'm the other co-president of Sustainability Club.
Hello, my name is Layla, and I am a member of the Sustainability Club.
Hi, my name is Luz, and I'm an environmental volunteer.
So what is a habitat? Well, habitats are places where living organisms live, and living organisms are organisms that are alive, they breathe, or they exist and they have cells and respond to their environment. And a habitat provides organisms with their ideal shelter, food, and climate conditions that they need to live. And organisms can vary on the conditions that they need to survive based off of evolutionary factors, or also known as the factors that they've developed over time. So just like us humans, we have our ideal shelter, which is our house, our ideal food, which is the kind of foods that we like and eat, and the climate, which is around 75 degrees, where you don't need a coat and you don't need, you're not sweating a lot. Organisms have these ideal places as well, and they find these in their habitat. A fish, for example, wouldn't live in the desert, and that's because fish are found in water, they live in water, and they need water to live. Whereas, the same reason for a dog not living underwater, because dogs don't live underwater, they can't live under the water, they have to live above ground and stuff like that. And also that cold-blooded animals or animals that really just cannot control their body temperature aren't able to survive in the Arctic, and this is because they cannot control their body temperature. So us humans, we shiver when we're cold, and that generates heat. However, these organisms can't generate heat, so if they live in cold environments, they'll just die. And if they live in overly hot environments, they could potentially die as well.
Definition of habitat destruction. It's when a natural habitat, such as a forest or wetland, is altered or changed so dramatically that it no longer supports the species that it originally sustained, or the species that were originally able to live in that specific habitat. Plant and animal populations are destroyed or displaced, and this leads to a loss of biodiversity. And this picture is basically an example of habitat destruction. So we can see that there was a bulldozer that tore down all these trees, and these trees were once a habitat for the organisms that lived in that forested region.
Types of habitat destruction. There are three main types of habitat destruction. One being habitat destruction, the second, habitat fragmentation, and the third, habitat degradation. All are equally terrible for the environment and the organisms that they support because they all result in the loss of homes for organisms to live in. Despite all having the same eventual impact, they all have different processes of destruction.
The first type of habitat destruction is habitat destruction itself. This occurs when a habitat is completely destroyed. This can be bulldozers taking down a large amount of trees, but it also taking resources from rivers, mines, cutting fields, and filling in wetlands as well. An example of this would be monkeys that live in a jungle having the jungle bulldozed for cocoa fields. And the image on your right is an example of a monkey's habitat that has been destroyed.
Another type of habitat destruction is called habitat fragmentation. And this occurs when a habitat is sectioned into smaller portions or isolated from the rest of the land. Habitat fragmentation often occurs when companies build new roads, buildings, or parking lots, and this affects habitats by tearing them down and separating these areas. You need to tear them down so that way you can place these new structures. And this causes roadblocks for organisms, and it gives predators the upper hand at finding prey. Upper hand or advantage, and this is because the prey is not used to the area, and then they get lost. And when you're lost, you're distracted, you're not focusing on predators, you have nowhere to hide, and so it's actually a lot easier to catch these prey. And it just causes these prey to die out at a quicker rate because of all these predators grabbing them. Also, when habitats are spaced out and animals are unfamiliar with the land, their survival instincts and conditions are threatened. And this can kind of relate to how, like, if you go on vacation, if you go to, for example, you go from Chicago to Orlando. Orlando is a lot different of a place. There's, you might not know the stores around there or the things to do compared to just Chicago. And however, so you're in an unfamiliar place, you're in a new place, and you can use Google Maps or maybe your parents to help you navigate around. However, organisms like wild organisms don't really have the same resources to do that. And if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, it depicts an example of habitat fragmentation. So as you can see on the left side of the picture, it's just a clear area, some grass, some trees, organisms live there, it's nice. And then it gets transformed with a road. So a road's built in the middle of it, and it separates, that road creates a divide in between what was once a big pasture into two separate pastures. And this can cause like a splitting of a population and create a lot of issues for organisms in that area.
The last type of habitat destruction that we're going to be talking about today is called habitat degradation. And this is when the quality of the habitat an organism lives in is decreased. This means it may no longer support the organisms that live there as much as it used to because there could be less resources or ideal shelter areas. So in the picture to our right, there's some polar bears, and polar bears live in the Arctic region. And basically, as the glaciers melt, they lose their habitat, or their habitat does not become as well resourced as it once was. So there's less land for having shelter. As you can see, they're having a hard time traveling across the plains. And then there's also less food sources. So as the habitat degrades, less organisms are able to survive, and that means that there's less options for food. This occurs because of pollution, invasive species, and ecosystem disruptions. So pollution would be when a company dumps oil, for example, into the water. For one, this blocks out sunlight, so plants aren't able to grow, and that kills off species for food sources. And then also, if there is oil, it suffocates the animals, and so that degrades the area that the organisms in the water live in, and it makes it impossible for them to live because it's not only toxic, but it's suffocating, and it leads to their deaths. We also can talk about invasive species. So basically, invasive species are species that travel from one area to another, and they either kill off important species or or native species to that area, or they can kill off their food source, so they can start eating their food source, and that would kill them off. An example of this would be zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are found in the United States, and basically what they do is they'll attach to boats. So if they're in water, then the zebra mussels can attach to the bottom of boats. And when the boats are put away for the winter, the zebra mussels are able to preserve themselves. And when they're moved to a new lake, possibly, that travels them to a new area, and that causes the zebra mussels to compete with the other organisms in that area for resources, and that leads to the deaths of many organisms. And then the last is ecosystem disruptions, and an example of this would be wildfires. So for example, in Australia, there were wildfires earlier this year, and this ecosystem disruption led to the loss of many resources and homes for animals, and it made it virtually or almost impossible for organisms to live there. And then we can talk about corals in the case of ocean acidification, like we've been talking about throughout this program. When the pH of the ocean decreases or becomes more acidic, it causes the corals to bleach or start to die out, and that's because we aren't used to the changes in pH, so we can only survive in certain conditions, and that would be like if we put our hand into hot lava, our hand would melt off. That's the same with the coral, they can't survive under those circumstances.
What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a community of living organisms with the non-living components of their environment that all interact as a system, or in other words, non-living and living organisms working together to survive. To the picture on your right, you can see that this is a pond ecosystem that incorporates a lot of different organisms that are, working together, but this also has one abiotic factor, which is the sun. And the sun is non-living and therefore abiotic, but it interacts with the ecosystem by providing sunlight that is needed for the process of photosynthesis in plants. Photosynthesis is how plants make their food because they can't eat other organisms, and the sunlight allows the process to begin. The living factors of an ecosystem are called biotic factors. This includes other plants, animals, and bacteria. The non-living factors are known as abiotic factors. Like I mentioned, the sun, but also rocks, water, sand, and other non-living things in an ecosystem. All abiotic factors interact in the ecosystem and help the organisms in that ecosystem thrive, or in other words, live in good conditions.
Impacts on ecosystems. The primary effect of habitat destruction is a reduction or decrease of biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the variety and amount of different species of living organisms in an area. When animals lose the home that they need to survive, it can cause their population to become extinct. It is estimated that 1 million species will go extinct by the year 2050. And this is insane considering that 1 million is a lot of different species, and that includes large populations in each of those species. Some species expected to be extinct are the hawksbill sea turtles, giant pandas, Asian elephants, polar bears, lemurs, gorillas, snow leopards, and many more.
Some more impacts on ecosystems is that habitat destruction, it can be especially dangerous to marine organisms. This is because the clearing of marshes and coastal estuaries removes breeding grounds for marine organisms. And the marine organisms that we're referencing in these kinds of talks is like largemouth bass, bluegills, minnows, and like some common carp fish. And so these organisms kind of lose where they make their children, and it can cause a massive decline in these populations. In addition to this, pollution can travel easily through streams and waterways, and it damages fish and other marine organisms. And the importance of this is that pollution traveling down a stream doesn't only affect just the organisms in the stream that it is. It also can affect organisms in the stream where the stream lets out. So a lot of rivers and streams empty out into large bodies of water, or they end in large bodies of water, such as lakes or oceans. And so this pollution, whatever it is from these companies that are dumping into the rivers, eventually makes its way out to those organisms, and it just damages all of them. And some of those organisms we actually eat, so it can cause a lot of problems for us as well. In addition to harming marine organisms and destroying marine habitats, for land organisms, deforestation takes away places for land organisms to hide and protect themselves. And it also takes away their breeding grounds for those organisms. So as I talked about with the marine organisms and their breeding grounds, the same applies for land organisms, such as, for example, monkeys or those kinds of organisms. They will lose their breeding grounds. And as we talked about a couple slides ago, with hiding and protection, without forests and trees and coverings to hide themselves, a lot of organisms will get swept up and eaten by predators. And that will cause a massive decline in these forest populations and create a lot of issues for us.
Habitat destruction around the world. Biodiversity hotspots such as tropical rainforests suffer some of the most habitat destruction. High numbers of humans taking up spaces where the habitat once was contributes to its diminishing or decreasing size. However, habitat destruction happens virtually everywhere, or almost everywhere, and it is why places such as Chicago or New York or other urban areas have been able to develop into cities. So basically, Chicago wasn't always a huge city. It once was a marsh or a great plains of land and it was actually inhabited by Native Americans, not just Chicagoans, or not just regular people from around the world. And that's because of habitat destruction. So the habitat was destroyed in order to build the cities, and that this happens everywhere. And land on every single continent is at risk of habitat destruction. So if we look at this map right here, we can see that in the United States and in North America, mostly the United States and Central America are affected by habitat destruction. In South America and Brazil and Argentina and Chile, there's a lot of habitat destruction. There's also habitat destruction in Asia and in Europe and in Africa. And then lastly, there's a lot of habitat destruction going on in Australia, and it's actually said to be one of the most sensitive places in the world right now to habitat destruction. And this is because earlier this year, I'm sure you guys have heard about this, there were major wildfires that occurred, and they resulted in the loss of a lot of habitat for organisms. And so they're still trying to recover all the organisms that were not only lost, but that have lost their habitats as well.
Habitat destruction in nature. When natural habitats cannot sustain present species, this forces species to evacuate into unknown habitats and possibly extinction. Burning coal may rain down acid rain on the environment, causing the habitat to become unsustainable by polluting the soil, which can be toxic for plants and animals. When nature is affected by harmful substances, it is not only kicking out animals that belong to the land, but also becomes harmful, meaning it may never be able to build itself up again. That means there will be no more trees, no more plants, less oxygen, and less food.
How are humans contributing to habitat destruction? Humans contribute to habitat destruction through many ways, such as deforestation, urbanization, and energy resources. The most important and well-known form of habitat destruction is deforestation. This can be for clearing land for agriculture, which contributes to the majority of deforestation, or cutting down trees.
Humans significantly contribute to habitat loss and can create irreversible destruction to their ecosystems. Humans destroy around 160,000 square kilometers of forest each year, and that is about 62,000 square miles. The size of Illinois, which is where Chicago is about 57,000 square miles. So each year around the world, we basically take out around the entire state of Illinois, it's a big state, plus a little bit more of just trees and forests. That's a lot of damage, and it creates a lot of issues for those organisms living there. And humans, in addition to this, also contribute to habitat fragmentation and habitat degradation all the time, and it really just damages these organisms' places to live.
How does habitat destruction affect us? If habitats and ecosystems become scarce, it poses a threat to humans' well-being and health. Besides animals, we also depend on habitats to provide shelter, food supplies, and clothing, because we need resources to come from somewhere. And if habitats near you are destroyed, animals are forced to be driven out, and that can increase the amount of animals that we have to save, which can be really expensive. We're going to have to contribute more money towards taxes or donating. But another thing that could happen is that we decide not to save them at all, which would be terrible on our part because we're invading their own homes.
Habitat destruction and climate change. Habitat destruction and climate change are the two greatest threats to global biodiversity. Both make conditions for organisms impossible to survive. Climate change can cause habitat destruction by causing droughts, floods, and wildfires. Ecosystems that are most deeply affected by climate change, such as those in the mountains and Arctic regions, are the most sensitive to climate change. The rising temperatures can melt glaciers and cause sea levels to rise. In mountains, climate change can cause river flows to change, which disrupts plant and animal wildlife.
Individual solutions to habitat destruction. We can choose transportation options that don't contribute greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. This would include taking your bike, going on, using your rollerblades, skating, or walking. Educate yourself and others about the habitats around you and how to protect, not invade them. Reduce the pollution in your community. This would include recycling, composting, and not using plastic items, and preserve the existing wetlands/drylands on your property. You can do this by growing plants and veggies to help control flooding or trees to provide more oxygen.
So what can we do as a global response to habitat destruction? Well, the Campaign for Nature is calling upon world leaders to take action in helping to protect around 30% of the Earth's land and ocean by 2030. This goal was set as a benchmark so that way world leaders can accomplish around 50% of Earth's land and protection of the oceans by 2050. In addition to protecting Earth's land and oceans, we can encourage the protection of key habitats through legislation. Examples of this, which have already been started, are national parks and marine protected areas. In the United States, there's about 62 national parks, such as Yosemite, Yellowstone, Red Forest, and High Springs National Park. And all of these areas provide protection for the organisms and wildlife there, and these are untouched by humans. Such areas of national parks and marine protected areas should be inclusive of the surrounding areas as well, so that way we can avoid habitat fragmentation and just disruption of habitats in general. And in addition, imposing regulations and punishments for companies who extremely damage habitats. So currently there are a lot of companies that dump into rivers and lakes, and there's also companies who cut down lots of trees and just create a lot of deforestation in the world. And so there should be some punishment or regulations, and both actually, for companies who do this in extreme ways. And to build off of the individual solutions, just teaching about habitat destruction and how to prevent it on large scale levels, like in classrooms and around the world in like big functions, which we'll talk about more on the sustainability slide.
Habitat destruction and sustainability. Today, only 15% of land and 7% of the ocean is protected. These numbers need to increase dramatically in a short amount of time, or by 2030, to stop irreversible damages to the environment, or damages that we cannot replace or undo. It is also very important to educate as many people, such as your family and friends, on the habitat destruction as possible and ways to prevent it from happening. Additionally, it is important that we as individuals band together to fight the damages that large corporations do to these habitats.